Nice to be here. Kasha and I have been working together for a few years, as she said, and it's always been Kasha coming to visit me in Australia, so it's nice to come here for a change. I do have an Australian accent, as you can hear, and sometimes when I get excited, I get carried away and go very fast and drop my consonants, so wave at me if I get a bit too sort of heavy in my Australian accent for you. I'm going to cover a broad kind of range of stuff today, but the theme that holds it all together for me is sort of an interest in the social determinants of eating, which is a topic I did my PhD on, specifically social influence and eating disorders. The perspective that I come from is, a sort of health psychological one, if you like, which is really says that there are a lot of different determinants of health behaviours, and they can broadly be broken down into your bio determinants, your psycho-determinants, and your social determinants. So in the context of eating, we'd talk about things like, an obesogenic environment as being one of those social determinants, or a thin ideal that is communicated to certain members of a society. I saw this poster last time I was in the UK on the London Tube. That was a nice one to be confronted with first thing in the morning. Or you might look at psychological determinants of eating behaviour. So things like self-control. Has anyone ever tried to do that with their dog? It is so funny. I strongly recommend it. Or perfectionism, which might play a particular role if you're looking at eating disorders, for instance. And then, of course, there's the biological determinants, so things like genetic determinants of weight and eating behaviour, as well as more contextual biological factors like hunger and satiety. Now, I am on board with all of these playing a role, and I think it would be extreme and clearly wrong to claim that the determinants of eating aren't at all of these levels. But a contention that I would put forward is that I think that the higher you get up in this hierarchy, the more neglected these determinants of eating are. And so my particular interest is in social determinants because I think they are often neglected, certainly by health practitioners and by clinical psychologists. So just some research to illustrate how neglected they are in kind of lay thinking is some research by Lenny Vartanian, who's an Australian researcher in this area, is in Australia now. And this is a study he and some colleagues ran in 2008 where they looked at, got participants to rank what they thought were their determinants of eating behaviour in the lab. And they gave them a whole bunch of different factors that may have played a role. And you can see here that they mostly thought in terms of psychological determinants. So it was how the food tasted, my particular preference for popcorn or chocolate or chips, and how hungry I was. But how much others ate, the social factors, right down the bottom there in terms of the extent to which participants think that this plays a role in determining how much they eat. And this is in stark contrast to what the data tell us, which is that actually in a lab-based environment, one of the strongest determinants of what people will eat is the behaviour of others eating in the lab. I think there's a couple of reasons why the social determinants of eating are often neglected. One potential reason is that a lot of that research is done in quite artificial environments that might be a bit remote from the applied practice areas that the health practitioners are working in. So they don't necessarily see the relevance to their day-to-day work with people who are experiencing problems with their weight or with their eating. Another reason may be that the theoretical links between these social determinants and health outcomes aren't always clear. That is, doctors might know that the person in front of them who's experiencing obesity and is struggling with their weight, that there are social factors involved, but they're not sure what to do about them or how it might be useful to communicate that to their clients. So I think bringing in a stronger theoretical understanding of why these social determinants are important in eating, as well as doing applied research that shows how it's relevant, to people experiencing problems with their eating, can perhaps bridge that gap. And that's where my research has been focused the last few years. So social influence in eating, as I said, is where I've had a lot of interest. And there's a lot of research now suggesting that social modelling, that is, eating behaviour being based on the eating behaviour of others who are present in that situation, is a primary determinant of human eating. So when this research was first conducted, back in 1974 is the first study that I've been able to find, experimental study of social influence in eating. They were testing what's called the externality hypothesis. Now, the externality hypothesis basically stated that people who are obese are more sensitive to external cues to eating and less sensitive to internal cues to eating. So they might fail to stop eating when they feel full, and they might be more influenced by, say, cues to eating like palatable food in the environment. However, what they found in this early research is that actually didn't hold, because regardless of people's weight, they tended to engage in very strong modelling of others' eating behaviour in the lab. Similarly, early research was interested in testing the boundary model, and the boundary model suggested that maybe we're only influenced by social factors when we're sort of middling in our degree of hunger. So if we get hungry enough, we'll stop social modelling, or if we get full enough, we'll stop modelling on other people. But again, that research found that that wasn't true. In fact, even if people fast for 24 hours before coming into the lab, they'll still reduce how much they eat if they're eating with someone who's eating a small amount of food. So again, there was not really any evidence that social modelling was moderated by hunger or satiety. The dominant model in this area is actually the normative model, which Peter Herman and Janet Polivy have sort of championed over the last 10 years or so. And this model really basically says that we look to others to determine what the appropriate amount is to eat in any particular context, and that we might be particularly sensitive to that in situations where we're uncertain about what is appropriate eating behaviour. So in some situations like, say, breakfast, we have really strong norms already in place about what we eat and how much is appropriate to eat and what types of food, so we might be less sensitive then to social modelling. But that model was developed in 2003, at which point there actually wasn't very many studies of eating behaviour in the lab that had been done. So the first bit of data I want to present to you today is a systematic review we conducted a couple of years back, looking at all of the experimental studies of eating that have been done in the lab, looking at social influence. And one of the reasons why I was driven to do this is because it struck me that although in the kind of social psychology and the health psychology world there is acknowledgement of the power of social modelling, you don't really see this being picked up on at all in the health promotion space or in the health practice space. That there is not really a kind of transfer of this research into practice. And I was interested in understanding why that might be, and whether by accumulating this evidence in one place that might help to do something about that. So the systematic review that we conducted, as I said, looked at all the studies that had an experimental design where there'd been a manipulation of the social norm for eating behaviour in the lab. And so that was done using either food choice or food intake as of the social reference. So that's either a live confederate, someone pretending to be a fellow participant eating in the lab, or what's called a remote confederate paradigm, which is where participants come into the lab and they read information about what previous participants have eaten. So in a very common way in which this is done in the lab studies is there'll be a sort of table sticky taped onto the table that the participants are sitting on with a bit of paper that says how many cookies previous participants ate. And the participant will be instructed something like, oh, don't worry about that, that was just so we knew how much food to order. So the cover story is that it's not relevant to the participant. But in fact, the remote confederate designs have been very successful in demonstrating social modelling. So we included those studies in the review. What we didn't include, though, is free eating dyad studies. So these are studies where, say, 2 or more participants come together into the lab at the same time, and we do see a strong correspondence between those participants' eating behaviour. So if one participant tends to eat fruit, the other participant's more likely to. But of course, because that's not experimental, it's not always obvious which direction the social influence is going in or what's the kind of driver there. So we just looked at the experimental studies here. And in all of these studies, we looked at a behavioural dependent variable. As many of you will be aware, there's increasing controversy around the kind of lack of correspondence between intentions in the eating behaviour space and actual behaviour. And so we were interested in the behavioural studies where people actually measured eating, or at least people chose a food when they thought they were going to be eating it. And we found 69 studies that had conducted experiments of this nature with almost 6,000 participants across that period from 1974 to 2014, which was the most recent studies available when we conducted the review. And I was really pleased to discover that actually there has been an upkick in interest in this area. So this is just the year of publication of the studies that were included in our review. And you can see how it's really in the last 7 or 8 years that we've started to see a lot more interest in these kind of studies, which I think is exciting and means we're kind of onto something, if you like. The kinds of studies that have been run, well, the majority were looking at food intake, so that is the amount of food that participants consumed, rather than food choice, whether people chose, say, a fruit platter or a hamburger. Those are less common, so we can say less about the social influence in those studies. They've included both live and remote Confederate paradigms, so that's the expensive to run studies where you have someone in the lab pretending to be a participant, as well as that bit of paper on the table. Most of the studies are with women, young women, and so it's actually really difficult with this data to do any comparison about this degree of modelling between women and men. I think only one of the 69 studies included just men, and most did not have enough men to really do a comparison. So we're still looking at a science of mostly young women when it comes to social influence and eating. But there are quite a few studies with children, nevertheless. We have 15 studies with children as young as 1 year old looking at food choice, a couple with adolescents and mostly with young adults. The majority also focus on snack food. So this is cookies, chips, sometimes popcorn, a couple looking at fruit and vegetable choice, but few of them. So it's mostly what we can speak to is actually snack food consumption. And the main finding that I think needs to be taken away from this review is that of the 69 studies that we reviewed, 64 of them found significant modelling effect, okay, whereby people were more likely to eat more when there was a high norm set for consumption of food, and they eat less when there's a low norm set for consumption of food. Okay? Or in the case of the food choice studies, if our Confederate eats vegetables, our participant is more likely to eat vegetables. So it's a very robust effect. Okay? Despite the fact that almost all of these studies set out to find a moderator, that is, they set out to find conditions under which this effect might go away. Nevertheless, there was a solid main effect in almost all of these studies where we see social modelling. And in fact, the few where you don't see it, I think all of them are really underpowered, and that's part of what's going on there. It's not statistically significant, but it's actually still some modelling going on. As I said, almost all these studies attempt to identify a moderator of some kind. So things like hunger, age, restraint status, so that is whether you're a kind of chronic dieter, participant weight, the presence of others versus the absence of others. And time again in these studies, the theme that emerges is it's actually really hard to make social modelling go away. It's a very robust effect. Some of the moderators that have been explored had mixed effects, so gender, attention, impulsivity, eating goals, not necessarily really clear. So for instance, there's been one study showing that cognitive load makes modelling more extreme, and one study showing that self-control makes modelling less extreme. So they're often in opposite directions, some of these studies, so it's not necessarily clear. But there was consistent evidence for 3 moderators in the literature so far in terms of what might make modelling stronger. And those are desire to affiliate, so when our participants seek to have a bond, a social bond with the person who is setting a norm for eating behaviour, when they perceive themselves to be similar to the person who's setting that norm, and snack food. So the modelling seems to be stronger for snack food intake than it is for meal intake. Does that make sense? So I wanted to show you an example of a study that has used this kind of paradigm, and that's one of the few to have actually shown that moderating, which I think tells us a little bit about why social influence is such a powerful determinant of eating behaviour. And this is a study that I ran during my PhD looking at shared group membership and eating behaviour. So it was one of these fun lab studies that had live Confederates. So we had 119 participants come into the lab for what they thought was a study of promotional videos for their university. So that's the Australian National University, ANU. And we told them that they would be judging promotional videos of the university, and that we were getting both ANU students, so that's their university, and CIT students, which is a kind of local technical college, to be evaluating these promotional videos. We also told them that to make them feel more relaxed, they would be given popcorn while they watched the promotional videos. So we then had a 2x2 design where they encountered a Confederate when they arrived at the study, and the Confederate, the fellow participant, they thought, was either an in-group member, so from ANU, the same university, or an out-group member, so from CIT, the technical college. And then the Confederate had eaten either all of their popcorn or none of their popcorn. And the dependent variable we're interested in here is the weight of popcorn that participants ate during their 15 minutes that they were watching the promotional video. So just to give you an example of what that looks like for participants, they come into the study, they're greeted by an experimenter wearing an ANU t-shirt who gives them a social identification scale with the ANU. So how much do you like ANU, feel a bond with ANU, feel like you belong at ANU? Then they go in to watch their ANU promotional videos and they encounter a previous participant wearing an ANU jumper who says, "Hi, I'm from ANU and I didn't eat any of my popcorn." They're a bit more convincing than that. And then they left the little room with their popcorn, and our participants sat down and got their own tub of popcorn while they were watching the videos. Or they encountered the previous participant who'd eaten all of their popcorn, or they encountered a CIT participant who hadn't eaten any popcorn or who had eaten all of their popcorn. And we also had a control condition where there was no previous participant. That's the cheap participants to run. What did we find? We found that popcorn consumption was highest when the in-group member, so that is an ANU previous participant, set a high norm for consumption. They said, "I ate all of that popcorn." And popcorn consumption was lowest when the previous participant set a low norm for popcorn consumption. Right? They didn't eat any of their popcorn. Okay? And both of those are statistically significantly different from the control condition. But I think actually what's more surprising about this study, having just looked at all what we found in the systematic review, is that we managed to get modelling to go away in the outgroup condition. Because what those previous studies have found is it's actually really hard to get people to stop modelling because we're very attentive to the eating behaviour of other people in our situation. However, when we're able to make a particular identity highly salient, in this case ANU identity, then what we find is that people stop attending to social reference that don't belong to that social category because they're no longer providing relevant information to them about what behaviour is normative in that context. So yeah, key result, only the in-group source influenced food intake in this study. So coming back to our systematic review, a kind of key question, I think, when you look at all of these studies is, well, why is this going on? What's happening here? Why is social influence such a powerful determinant of something that, at least in theory, should be biologically driven, right? Like we need to eat. And there have been two motives put forward that have been tested in a variety of studies. One which is sort of affiliation-based. We're just seeking to kind of create a social bond between ourselves and others, and so we're just mimicking what they're doing. Versus an uncertainty reduction motive, which is the idea that, as I outlined before in the normative model, really is that we're looking to discover what is an appropriate behaviour in a particular context, and we're looking to social reference to help us with that. However, the studies that have been run, to me, suggest that it can't actually be one or the other. It has to be both. Just in the way I remember which is which, to me, affiliation is you're doing it to be liked. Uncertainty reduction is you're doing it to be right, in terms of just simplifying down your social influence motives. But impression management alone, that is the to be liked, can't fully account for the findings because we know that modelling persists when participants believe that no one can observe their eating behaviour. So in studies where there is no one else present and there's a remote confederate and participants think that the experimenters don't have access to information about how much they ate, they still model. So it's not just about sending a signal to other people that you're like them. It also can't just be unconscious mimicry that we automatically align our behaviour with others. Because although there have been a few studies showing that we do mimic others' eating behaviour, so in the 2 seconds after you see someone take a bite of food, you are more likely to take a bite of food. But it can't account for the findings because, again, we see that modelling continues even when there isn't a live confederate, when there isn't a person in front of you to model your eating behaviour on. So in my mind, that means that it can't be one or the other of these two motives. It really has to be both. It has to be that we are desiring to affiliate with others and to get information about what is appropriate behaviour, but not all others. Selectively with others that we are actually interested in affiliating with because they are part of our social referent group. And that's consistent with a social psychological theory which explores social influence as a kind of abstract theoretical process and describes this as referent informational influence, which is a self-categorization term for exactly what we're talking about here, right? We're interested in reducing uncertainty, but only from specific social reference, that is, those which share a group membership with us. Okay, so just key takeaway messages from a systematic review before I get into the more applied stuff. And that is that I think social modelling of eating is robust. If you take one thing away today, I think that's a really key message, and it occurs across most people and most contexts in which it's been studied. The most parsimonious model of why that happens is referent informational influence. And thirdly, applied studies of this effect are lacking. Almost all of the studies have been done with snack food intake, the amount of snack food you eat in a laboratory context with quite a specific population, that is young women. And so where it's not necessarily clear how much of this research can apply to understanding applied problems of eating like obesity and eating disorders. And my view is that that's a lot of the reason why it hasn't necessarily been as influential in the health space as it could have been. And so that's sort of where I've turned my attention over the last couple of years, is trying to extend this research into more of an applied domain and look at whether social influence plays a role in not just healthy, normal eating behaviour, but also disordered eating behaviour. Because social norms don't have to just be about eating, right? They can also be about things like body shape and body satisfaction, which is a term for that's often used, is that we can have normative discontent, where among certain members of society, disliking your body and feeling uncomfortable about it and desiring a certain ideal can actually become normal. Not just disordered or abnormal, but normal. And so you might see that those sort of norms have similar influences over our eating behaviour and our choices as do norms about eating. And some of you will have heard the term fat talk before. Is that familiar? So fat talk is where, and most women will have experienced this with their mothers, that's the main environment where it seems to happen, is where someone will say, one woman will say to another woman, "Oh, I wish I could wear that dress. I can't because my thighs just look too fat in that." And the other one says, no, you look lovely, but I am too fat to wear this dress. You know? So you put yourself down and express that normative discontent in a kind of social context. And it's typically a conversation style that has been observed among young women in Western countries. And one of the things that I was interested in is whether this fat talk is a way that these norms are communicated between women. So we know that the thin ideal is something that exists at a kind of cultural, social contextual level, but how does it get communicated between individuals and within social groups? And my view is that fat talk is a key way in which that's done. I was also interested in what function it might serve socially. Is it maintaining relationships among these women who are engaging in this behaviour? Is it not acceptable, or does it damage your relationship if you diverge from this normative behaviour? And so to explore this, we conducted a study with pairs of young women. So we have 85 women, because one of them, the data didn't work. So if you were looking at your pairs, you'd think 85, that's an odd number. That's because we lost data from one participant. And these women were, aged 17 to 25, and they presented to the lab in pairs of friends. So they already knew each other. And we assigned them to one of three conditions. So the context of the study was we told them we were interested in social media and the way in which women communicate over social media. And then they were taken to separate rooms and completed a computer task, which was designed to look like a messenger program. And the messenger program showed them images of female celebrities of different sizes and shapes and ages and ethnicities. And then they were presented with a comment from their friend and then given an opportunity to respond to that comment. But in fact, it wasn't the friend's communication. We randomly assigned them so that they received communication from their friend that was either neutral, which in this case meant not related to appearance or eating. Fat talk, which meant that 12 out of the 20 comments that they received from their friend were of that nature that I gave you an example of before. So putting the self down, endorsing the thin ideal, and generally expressing body dissatisfaction. Or positive body talk. So that's more accepting, holistic beauty, focused on the body as a kind of functional organism rather than as an appearance object. And we were interested in what effect these different forms of communication from the friend would have on the participants' level of disordered eating correlates, so things like body dissatisfaction, dieting intentions, thin ideal internalization, as well as the participants' actual behaviour. How do you respond when your friends start talking to you this way? So we measured actual participant fat talk. We also looked at friendship length and quality. So what do you think of your friend when they start talking to you this way, as well as those correlates of disordered eating. So this is just a little bit of an example of what the messenger paradigm looks like here. So they see an image of a celebrity here, a female celebrity, and friend A says something first. I should say all the participants were assigned to be friend B. So they thought that was random, but all of them were friend B. Friend A says something like, "I wish people would stop obsessing with what she wears and what she looks like." So that's a positive body talk comment. And then friend B has about 20 seconds to write a response that they think is sent to their friend. Okay, so what do we find? Well, firstly, we find that fat talk does shape the correlates of disordered eating. So there were significant differences on body dissatisfaction, negative affect, and thin ideal internalization between our fat talk condition and our two other conditions. So this, I think, is interesting because there actually hasn't been any research on positive body talk particularly. Like what does it mean to talk kind of positively about the body and still sort of value the body, but not in this sort of negative, judgy way. But what we found is it was comparable to the neutral talk conditions for our participants. So you see here that participants experienced the most body dissatisfaction, the most negative affect, and the most internalization of the thin ideal, so that is valuing thinness, when they were exposed to fat talk from their friends. This is a little bit of a complicated graph, but I'll talk you through it. What we found, though, is that basically all of those effects, so the relationship between which condition the participants were in and those outcomes of correlates of disordered eating, they were all fully mediated through the expression of fat talk. So when I hear my friend engaging in this kind of talk, that makes me feel worse about myself and my body, makes me value thinness and want to diet, but only to the extent that I respond to my friend with fat talk. I engage in fat talk myself. A sort of interesting aside, I think, is that there was an interesting moderating effect of existing friendship group norms on how fat talk from the friend was actually evaluated in this study. So to talk you through what we see here, on the bottom, we've broken this down into friendship groups which either had existing pro-fat talk norms. So this is things like, in my friendship group, we talk about diets, we exchange dieting tips, we talk about how we don't like our bodies, versus anti-fat talk norms, so as we don't do those things. I should say that this data is analysed with treating that as a continuous variable, but I've split it into two for graphing purposes. And then here on the DV, you'll see positivity of the friendship rating. So how much do you like your friend after this exercise? And what we see is that if you're in a friendship group which has these pro-fat talk norms, then having a friend who doesn't talk about their body actually means you like that friend significantly less after that interaction. So they're engaging in a counter-normative way within that friendship group, right? They've just been exposed to all these pictures of female celebrities and bodies, and they've persistently not talked about those bodies, and you end up feeling annoyed with them, not liking them as much. What we see, though, in the anti-fat talk norm friendship groups, though, where we don't have that existing norm of talking about bodies and dieting and disliking our bodies, is pretty much the opposite. So we see here that the friends who engaged in neutral talk were actually liked the most at the end of that exercise. They liked that their friend persistently didn't talk about the bodies and the appearance of the celebrities, whereas friends who fat talked were liked the least among those participants. What you can see, though, here is that positive body talk, I'd say, is sort of consistently acceptable, actually, across those friendship group norms. So a sort of surprising outcome of this study for me, really, because I didn't know what to make of positive body talk, really, is that it seemed to have very few negative consequences across these different dependent variables. It protected you against those disordered eating type outcomes, as well as protecting your friend from being disliked for acting in a kind of counter-normative way. So this is a study, I think, that was trying to establish, do we see the kind of social influence effects we see on actual eating behaviour extending into the disordered eating realm? And I think on the whole we can say that yes, we do, because fat talk is a social behaviour that transmits the thin ideal between individuals. So we are learning about these social contextual determinants of health on a very individual level, okay, from our friends within our valued social networks. And so those communication norms then have implications for our personal health as well as our social relationships. Right? These are not inconsequential these kind of conversations we have about our bodies and our eating behaviour. And I think this also suggests that when we're talking about interventions, there's evidence increasingly that the level of the friendship group may actually be an appropriate place to start considering interventions, because disordered eating is not just something that occurs to pathological individuals that are on the end of the spectrum, but also something that occurs in social networks. And if you've got a pathology that's at the level of the social group, perhaps we need to speak to the social group when we're designing interventions. But what do we do if we're trying to do that? How does that look like? What kinds of interventions are out there that might target social factors in dealing with disordered eating? Well, there is at least one that I was able to find, and it's called the Body Project. The Body Project is an intervention led by Eric Stice, who's a pretty big name in the eating disorder space. And this is a program that is conducted in small groups of young women who are considered at risk of disordered eating, so they have body, shape, weight concerns. And they basically discuss the thin ideal together, and they talk about why they don't like it in small groups. In the words of the team who wrote the program, the Body Project is a cognitive dissonance-based body acceptance intervention that was designed to help adolescent girls and young women resist socio-cultural pressures to conform to the thin ideal and reduce their pursuit of thinness. It has a good evidence base now. They say that for every 100 at-risk young women who complete this program, they prevent approximately 9 full-blown eating disorders from developing. Okay? So it would seem to have a pretty good evidence base, and there's been about 10 randomised control trials now run by about 5 different research groups. So a kind of growing evidence base. This program is based on the kind of thin ideal internalization model, which is Stice's model, that says that you see individual differences between people in their endorsement of the cultural value placed on thinness for women, that sociocultural phenomenon is internalised within individuals. And it's theorised to be causally related to disordered eating. Sorry, this has adjusted my slides on my behalf, but this is approximately the model that Stice proposes. So thin ideal internalisation is problematic because it leads to body dissatisfaction due to the discrepancy between one's desired body ideal and one's actual body, or what's realistic. It leads to dieting and increasingly extreme strategies for weight loss, which ultimately results in eating pathology. That's their model. In terms of why the Body Project actually works, the theory that Eric Stice and colleagues put forward is that it's based on cognitive dissonance, which you'll all be familiar from as a kind of traditional social psychological concept, which is that we experience dissonance when we notice a difference between our behaviour and our attitudes. And that sometimes we, rather than changing our behaviour, we'll change our attitudes to bring it more into line with our behaviour. And so what Stice says is that the Body Project works because we, in groups, young women engage in behaviours and discussions that challenge the thin ideal. And so increasingly they observe themselves doing that and decide, oh, actually, I don't like the thin ideal after all. And so hence the program is effective. But I'm not sure I completely buy that interpretation of why this program is effective, because, I mean, as someone who's interested in the social determinants of eating, I think the Body Project is a social intervention. It's conducted in small groups of young women who expect to think similarly about things like dieting, thinness, and eating. So to me, it seems very plausible that it could have social mechanisms of action, not just cognitive mechanisms of action like cognitive dissonance. And so that's the study I want to show you last of all today, is exploring social mechanisms of action for the Body Project as an intervention to prevent eating disorders. So this study was conducted with 113 young women who were at risk of eating disorders. So they were experiencing body, shape or weight concerns. And they were screened for eating disorders, so any participants who had an actual eating disorder, diagnosable eating disorder, were not eligible for the program because it is a prevention intervention, not a treatment intervention, so they were referred elsewhere. And the groups were facilitated by graduate students in clinical psychology at the University of Queensland, and they did that in pairs. The design of this study was that participants completed a pre-questionnaire, so that is before they did session 1 of the body project. Then they completed a short questionnaire, just 1-pager, after each session of the body project, so that's a 4-session program, each session about 60 minutes. And then they completed a post-questionnaire, which is like a big one at the end. So note, this is not a randomised control trial. We weren't looking to demonstrate the effectiveness of this intervention in this study. We were more interested in the mechanism, so pre-post changes. And what we found, though, just to clarify that the program was effective, because although it was an RCT, in order to look at mechanisms of effectiveness, it still needs to be effective. So the good news is that's what we found. So we see a significant decrease in body dissatisfaction, dieting intentions, and thin ideal internalisation from time 1 to time 5 of the program. But what I think is more interesting is looking at session-by-session change in participants' subjectively perceived norms of that group. Okay, so this is just tracking here what the proportion of pre-intervention score for thin ideal internalisation, and I'll show you in a moment, descriptive norms. So descriptive norms refers to what they think other members of their body project group do and think. So it's things like, other members of this group engage in dieting, dislike their bodies, talk about strategies to lose weight. And what you see here is that you actually see in these participants much faster change across time in the descriptive norms of the group than you do in the thin ideal internalisation, which here is a proxy for risk of disordered eating. So almost immediately, so to remember, time 2 here is just at the end of the first session. So time 1 is pre-intervention, time 2 is basically an hour later after they've completed session 1 of the body project. And you see there's already a really marked decrease, a 30% decrease in participants' scores on the extent to which they think that they're in a group of people who engage in these kind of behaviours, thoughts and feelings. So descriptive norms of the group drop off first, and then we start to see change in thin ideal internalisation. But critically here, one does actually predict the other. So if we're looking at here on the y-axis, you've got proportion of time 1 score. We see this is the participants who experience low norm change. So here time 1 to time 2 refers to beginning and end of the body project. And you can see people who experience low norm change, so they thought that there was a decrease in the degree to which their group endorsed thinness and dieting, they experienced an improvement in their symptoms, but you see a much steeper decline among those participants who thought there was a greater degree of norm change in that group. Okay, so to the extent that you think that other members of your body acceptance group are saying things like, you know what, we don't like this thin ideal thing. I don't want to be on a diet anymore. Maybe we should like the way we look and feel good about ourselves. When you start to think that that is happening in your body project group, you experience better change yourself in terms of these risk factors. Okay. We can also see here, one of the analyses I won't present on the slides, but that we also conducted as a more kind of conservative way of testing this, is looking at norm change in the first 2 sessions, predicting change in correlates of disordered eating in the last 2 sessions of the program. And that's also significant, whereas the reverse isn't. So it seems that we see social change and normative change first, and then we start to see change in individual attitudes and beliefs. So takeaway messages from that study. Interventions that target thin ideal internalisation are effective at reducing risk factors in at-risk young women. So those sociocultural and social determinants that I started with at the beginning of today's talk seem to be really critical in predicting people's risk factors, and if we can target that, we can get change in individuals. But this is at least in part due to the normative change, which then facilitates change in the cognitive, affective and behavioural risk factors for disordered eating. So just to wrap up today and kind of bring some conclusions before, I'd love to engage in a discussion with you all, so we're not in a hurry to race out of here. The 3 things that I think are really critical in terms of today's talk. Firstly, eating behaviour is shaped by social determinants. And when I say social determinants, we can talk about all kinds of things, but the 3 I'm particularly interested in are social context, social norms, and social identity. And to the extent that we can intervene at the level of these things, we can start to actually do something about the problems themselves. So that is, if we take these social determinants seriously, this will actually suggest new avenues for effective social intervention, not just clinical intervention, which is where we are at the moment when it comes to actually dealing with the applied consequences of eating behaviour. Okay, I'll leave it there today, but I'd love to have a discussion with you about this stuff. Thank you.
For taking time out of your represent to come and join us here. And as I said, we'll be in the recording shed from 5 p.m. if you fancy a drink. Other than that, have a great afternoon and thanks again.
Cheers.
Do we just switch it cell phone? Or?
I think that was probably me.
Great. Cool. Thanks for that. This is a lot of good stuff that I missed all of it now. Thank you so much.
Oh, no worries.